Good evening, everybody. My name is Sonia Skeets and I'm one of the Associate Fellows in the International Law Program here at Chatham House, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our event and discussion on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70. Some of you may already know that next year is the 100th anniversary of Chatham House. And we were conceived as part of a great transatlantic conversation about international politics and how to improve them. And ever since that time, the history of Chatham House has been deeply intertwined with the development of the international rules-based system, which was really one of the great achievements of the last 100 years. And of course, one of the really important elements of that order is a human rights system that looks globally at protections for the rights of individuals. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was concluded under the auspices of the United Nations General Assembly 70 years ago, really is the cornerstone of that very important element of the international system. From a legal and institutional perspective, the UDHR was the midwife to a truly impressive array of international treaties and standards at both the global and regional levels. And of course, it has inspired bills of rights, by that or other names at the domestic level in so many countries. And of course, the UDHR also is the preeminent reference point for the human rights movement, which also, I guess, celebrates its 70th anniversary, at least in, in some kind of formal terms with this moment. And of course, that, gave rise to what I would say is one of the most impressive civil society movements the world has ever known. And yet, in this moment, we find ourselves in very difficult times. Probably we have not, since that foundational moment, faced a situation where the values, the standards, the ideas that underpin the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course the norms themselves that it gave rise to, have been so imperilled. And so this really is a very important moment for us, not only to celebrate 70 years of the achievements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also to be asking some very probing questions about how we confront the challenges that we are facing. And you will know, I'm sure, what I'm referring to here, but essentially the assault from xenophobic, populist, authoritarian impulses that are sweeping many parts of the world at the moment, including many democracies, sadly. So that's the backcloth to our discussion tonight. When conceiving this event, we had two very particular and I think very important questions in mind in order to sort of frame our thinking. The first was around how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international human rights law system more generally is responding to many human rights related challenges that arguably were never in the minds or couldn't have been necessarily of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we're thinking here about things like the rising global economic inequality that is afflicting us, climate change, the rise of new technologies and the human rights challenges coming along with that. So one of the things that I think will distinguish our discussion tonight from so many of the other events around the world that are taking place is that we want to focus on that. And also this question of whether we have the right kinds of innovations underway in order to equip civil society actors and others with the tools, networks, skills in order to confront those forces that I referred to before. So though they are, I guess, some of the kind of questions that we want to be looking at tonight. We have three outstanding speakers who I will introduce briefly. Julie Broom, who is the director of the Ariadne network of funders here in Europe who look at all kinds of human rights and social justice causes. We have Phil Bloomer, who is the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre here in London. And finally, Alison Corkery, who is the Director of the Rights Claiming and Accountability Program at the Centre for Economic and Social Rights in New York, currently here in London as an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics. So we're going to start with Julie, followed by Phil, and then Alison. Each of our three speakers will speak for roughly around 10 minutes. And then we should have about 45 minutes or so to build a discussion with all of you. Finally, I wanted to emphasise that we are on the public record tonight. This is not one of the events where we will be using the Chatham House rule. We are live streaming the event, and we really encourage you to live tweet. So enough from me, over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. I think it's a great opportunity to really think about where we are in the world today and how far we've come from the time that the UDHR was drafted. As Sonia mentioned, I am the director of a network of European donors who support social change and human rights issues. So I've been asked to reflect a little bit on the challenges and opportunities from the perspective of those donors. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to cover a lot of ground in my 10 minutes, but I hope that it will provide a bit of an overview for the rest of the discussion. One of the key challenges that we've been seeing as donors globally, not just in Europe, is what we've been referring to as the closing space for civil society. And this is not limited to the backlash against human rights and against the human rights instruments, but it is very closely connected to it. When we're talking about closing space, what we're referring to are things like legislative restrictions on civil society, including restrictions on foreign funding, barriers to registration, restrictions on political activities, as well as restrictions on things like protests and other forms of public assembly. So primarily these target civil society organizations that are deemed to be doing political work, which many times means human rights work. It can also mean other kinds of environmental justice work, but things that are challenging the state. So I think that one of the main challenges that we're seeing is how do we as donors and as civil society really continue to keep civil society alive and thriving. And by that, I don't necessarily mean keeping individual organizations alive for the sake of it, but it's really about keeping those avenues of challenging the state open, really keeping that possibility for public assembly, for civic participation, and for criticizing and analyzing what the state is doing. I'll come back a little bit later in my remarks to some of the ways in which donors are trying to respond to that particular trend, but it is an overarching one that has really been at the forefront for many human rights actors and human rights donors for the past 5-6 years, and there's really no sign that that's going to abate anytime soon. Another one of the kind of big overarching challenges that we're grappling with, that our members are grappling with, and as Sonia already referred to, is rising populism. Obviously, this is not a purely European trend. This is also global, but it's something that's of particular concern right now for European human rights actors and European donors, in part because of the European parliamentary elections that are scheduled to take place in May next year. The EU Fundamental Rights Agency released its second Minorities and Discrimination report about a year ago, which was a survey of over 25,000 minorities in the EU, which showed that hate-motivated harassment and discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and religion is quite strong still in Europe right now. And there is a real risk at the moment that with these parliamentary elections, more populist and far-right politicians could gain access to European Parliament. And that risk is being exacerbated by the activities of people like Steve Bannon, who, as you may know, has been very active in Europe trying to galvanize support for right-wing organizations. So this has become a real focal point, I would say, in the last several months, is recognizing the kind of urgency of trying to mobilize citizens to vote in the parliamentary elections, because turnout has historically been fairly low, but also ensuring that voters understand the importance of human rights, of European values, and civic participation more generally, to try to prevent a negative outcome. Similarly, there is a real backlash happening, again, across the world, but also here in Europe, against LGBTI, women's rights, and sexual and reproductive rights more generally. A number of states have refused to ratify the Istanbul Convention on the combating violence against women and domestic violence, because they think that it opens the door to different concepts of gender. And although same-sex marriage is not mentioned anywhere in that convention, they see some sort of specter of that. So, Bulgaria, for example, has refused to ratify that Council of Europe declaration. So, and once again, the sort of movements that are coalescing around that have the European parliamentary elections in their sights. The World Congress of Families, which is a sort of Mormon-funded group that is, has some challenging ideas on sexual and reproductive rights, has moved its meeting up earlier to take place before those elections, again, to sort of mobilize support for their causes. So, although those elections are not, not going to be the thing that makes or breaks human rights for the entire future, it is a mobilizing point that I think is really important for European funders and European human rights actors right now, because this is an opportunity to try to set the stage for the next few years. Whereas if that body becomes more populist, more right-wing, then that kind of erodes some of the institutions that we have that help protect human rights in Europe. So I've painted a bit of a grim picture for you, but there are opportunities, which I will try to highlight for you as well. One silver lining to all this, I think, is that all of these challenges, because they're so big and they're so complex, has really motivated both NGOs and funders to work more in coalition than I think they have in previous years. There's really a recognition that you can't go it alone to solve these things. So we're seeing much more cooperation and much deeper cooperation than we have before. Similarly, more donors are thinking about movement building and about intersectionality, thinking about how there are opportunities to make the field more effective by bringing different movements together, creating allies between them. So this is a very positive movement, I think. Similarly, movements like the Me Too movement, that's really opened up a possibility for more discussion in a more public space about ending violence against women and girls. It has made visible practices that have been going on for a long time. At the same time, the criticism and reflection on that movement has opened up space for thinking more about, what is the intersection between violence against women and issues of race, of class, of sexual orientation. And again, though these discussions are difficult, it opens up possibilities for deepening our movements and deepening our understanding of our work in the long run. I've given sort of a very broad overview thus far, but I'm going to try to touch on a few of the specific issues that Sonia mentioned, including, first, economic inequality. This has been a central issue for European donors for a number of years, particularly given the austerity measures that have been taken in different countries since the financial crisis. At a practical level, what that has meant is that there's an increased demand on private donors as services that were previously funded by the state have been reduced or cut. So this raises questions for donors as to whether the proper response is to just plug those gaps or to really try to address the underlying structures that have led to these inequalities and to the need for these services in the first place. There's also a recognition that inequality is driving some of the social tensions and divisions that I already referred to, and that for that reason, it needs to become central in the analysis. So some foundations have been looking at, a small but very committed group of foundations, looking at a transformation of the economic system and questioning how they can encourage that. Obviously, that's a very long-term project, but in the more immediate term, that means funding things at the very local level that address issues like food poverty and shortages of adequate housing, really trying to empower people at a local level and engage them in the solution of local problems. Other funders are taking a more systems change approach, bringing together different actors and different movements to try to address structural change in society. Okay. Sorry. I will speed up now. On climate change, I think this is increasingly being recognized as a human rights issue, whereas once it was seen very much as an environmental issue. Again, climate change-driven migration is only likely to exacerbate the social integration issues that we're seeing. I think one of the lessons that we've learned from the migration crisis in Europe is that the humanitarian response is only the tip of the iceberg and only the beginning. And actually, the longer-term challenge is integration. And how do we address some of those tensions at the social level? In terms of emerging new tech, I think it's a double-edged sword. Donors are looking at ways that tech can make their own work more accessible and can advance some of the causes that they care about. So, for example, UK donor funded mobile technology to make social services more accessible to people living with disabilities. When you see examples like that, that's great. But at the same time, there is a concern that civil society and philanthropy don't necessarily have an adequate understanding of the impacts of technology and could get caught out on the back foot. So one of the social implications that is a concern is how are things like machine learning and algorithmic decision-making replicating bias? For example, in the criminal justice system, where you have machines making decisions or recommendations about who's likely to reoffend and who's eligible for parole on the basis of an extremely biased situation that has, or system that has put the data into that. So finally, I just wanted to close thinking about how donors are responding to this narrative about human rights that's very negative right now. And there's a lot of focus on strategic framing and communication and how we communicate about human rights in ways that resonate with people and show that human rights really benefits them. So there are efforts to use art and popular culture. I think human rights organizations have really learned that people don't read their nicely researched reports, and that we need other mediums of communication with people because it's about stories. And it's about creating those stories that really resonate with people and show how it connects to them on a very local, personal level. So I think what we need going forward is a vision of human rights that people can see themselves in, that they can connect with. And that vision is likely not a bunch of lawyers sitting in Geneva, but something much closer to home. So really trying to develop those roots in communities.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thanks for going wide. That's going to, I think, really help us. We're going to go now to a particular corner with Phil, who's going to be talking about, something certainly that wasn't in the minds of the framers, the sort of applicability of human rights standards to the private sector. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much. And I mean, you're right in many ways, and yet it's also important to remember that perhaps the first human rights movement in the world was the anti-slavery movement, which was a business and human rights movement in that sense. And, in that sense, business and human rights has always been part of the agenda. But you're absolutely right, it's not. It's generally seemed to have somehow emerged in the last 20 years. So I think that's an important one. I wanted to start really by just saying, last year, 10 workers in Thailand escaped slavery. They managed to get out of a chicken farm that was producing 4 ready-made meals in Europe, bought by many retailers here. When those people, the organisation that had helped them escape, when they managed to get out, they took with them their time cards to demonstrate that they'd been held, basically forced to sleep with the chickens, and that they'd been working 18 and 20-hour days. When the organisation then organised a press conference to reveal what had happened to those people and the conditions that they were in, and that there were many more just like them, but were unable to escape, what happened was the company involved took out a lawsuit against those 10 individuals, accusing them of theft, and therefore, which is a criminal offence, which has a custodial sentence. After 6 months, that custodial sentence, the court case was dismissed by a judge. The company is now appealing, and this week the company has put 5 new criminal prosecutions up against the organisation of migrant workers that were helping those people escape. Now, the reality is that there's very little prospect that that company is going to win those 5 cases and the appeal, but that's not the game that they're playing. The game is not to win those cases. The game is to destroy the organisation that is helping those people escape forced labour, to destroy them by bankruptcy and by intense, time-consuming effort on a litigation case. And they can do that because they've got the money. They've got extraordinary money to be able to pay into those legal fees, and that they know that the migrant organisation has virtually no money at all, and certainly no reserves. So now, the reason I mention that is also because in Thailand, we've seen the flip side to that. We've seen a case where, one of the European retailers, actually the CEO of that retailer, flew from Europe to Thailand to testify in defence of some of other people that had managed to escape slavery in the pineapple industry. We also had even the Pineapple Industries Association of Thailand putting up bail for those people who'd been, who'd managed to escape slavery and yet were being prosecuted. So you get these 2 fundamentally different approaches of companies, of business, to the way in which people are to be treated as human beings or as commodities in this current age. And I use that example really to start because of 2 reasons. First of all, to celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because we'll spend a lot of time at 30,000 feet in this discussion, but as Eleanor Roosevelt said at the time of the Declaration, she said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close at home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And she spoke of extraordinary wisdom, I think, in that, given that she was based in New York in a rather grand mansion. But her ability to demonstrate the compassion that's necessary for people in those kind of conditions spoke legions. The second reason I mentioned that, I gave that example, is because it demonstrates the profound inequality of power and wealth that has grown up in global markets, particularly over the last 40 years. It was never brilliant, but it's grown enormously, and that's partly to do with, inevitably, the economic system that has dominated over the last 40 years. And that inequality of power and wealth basically defines the context in which business and human rights has emerged from and with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It emerges in terms of the global supply chains, in food, in apparel, in ICT, but it also emerges in the foreign direct investment and direct operations of companies such as extractives. And that power can be abused or abused, as we've seen. Now, the field of business and human rights, I think, is poised for yet more a new level of impact over this next period. But it will depend greatly on how the business and human rights movement organises, but also whether it's prepared to tackle some of the fundamental and principal causes of the abuse, which we spend a lot of time trying to address. And those are fundamentally issues of inequality of power and wealth, but also the ecological crisis that is upon us, that is also driving greater levels of polarisation and conflict. Now, some of that is to do with, therefore, the great transformations that are upon us also in terms of the need for us to move to a zero-carbon economies around the world very, very quickly. How are we going to do that in ways which respect human rights rather than undermine human rights? I'll come back to that. The second is on tech and human rights. Again, extraordinary challenges, as we've heard. I'll come back to some of those. Two which I won't go into, but which can go into in questions, is mass migration and refugee flows, which again is setting a huge amount of vulnerable people adrift in the world. Those people will either be trafficked into some of the worst conditions of work and exploited ruthlessly, or they will be given succor and become part of the shared prosperity that we all hope this world will enjoy. And equally, we've got the democracy and human rights issues, which are in fundamental flux at the moment. So, from my perspective, human rights in business was given in great momentum by the global economic crisis in 2008 and its aftermath. The collapse of public trust, demonstrated by the Edelman Trust Barometer, the collapse of public trust in global markets at that time has led to, far from the golden age of capitalism and globalization, it's led, in fact, to a world where, in the public mind, global markets are associated with poverty wages or stagnant wages, with precarious employment, rising levels of inequality, and ecological crisis. That fear and distrust, of course, is being exploited, as you would expect. There's no surprise to this. Of course, ruthless politicians, chauvinist nationalists, authoritarian demagogues, it's Christmas for them. This is their great moment, and they hope it will continue for a very long time, because they are the people that will gain out of that, rather than shared prosperity, that shared penury that will emerge. And for business and human rights, this polarised context is, of course, an enormous challenge, but it's also an enormous opportunity. Because surely putting human rights back at the core of business has to be at least one of the most profound opportunities to address some of the enormous public mistrust which has grown up in terms of global markets since 2011. Because the other big moment for the business and human rights was in 2011, when the UN guiding principles were agreed by consensus, companies and governments. But the pace of implementation of those guiding principles has simply been glacial. You know, in the 8 years since then, 21 of the 190 states have delivered a national action plan, and many of those national action plans need a little bit of polishing before they actually become very effective in terms of the scale of the scale of the challenges which we face. But equally, some of you will know that this last week we published the latest corporate human rights benchmark with Aviva investors, with Nordea Bank, Institute for Human Rights, and APG. And in there again you see the glacial pace. That looks at 100 of the largest companies in the world in the highest risk regions. What emerges out of that is that 40% of those largest companies in the highest risk regions, 40% of them fail to have any sense of human rights due diligence and/or mitigation efforts in their own operations at the moment. That's 40% of them. It's an alarmingly low number, and there's many other low numbers alongside them. But at the same time, there is a small cluster of leaders who are way out ahead of the mass of those that are scoring under 3 out of 10. 60% score 3 out of 10. Now, those leaders demonstrate what is actually commercially viable and what is a moral imperative, the delivery of human rights due diligence in the operations of business. And many could learn from them very quickly. But we also need, in our opinion, governments to step in, because that breach that's opened up between the leaders and the laggards demonstrates also the need to raise the floor of minimum corporate behaviour through regulation, international as well as national, and incentives that provide business, responsible business, with a reward for doing the right thing by their people in their global supply chains and their operations. Now, I'll turn briefly to two of the issues that we mentioned earlier. The first on civic freedoms and human rights defenders. Julie's already spent some good time on. I'll just say that we hold a database of about a database that we started 2 years ago. That already now is populated with 1,300 cases of intimidation, attacks and murders that have been done because brave people are standing up to reckless investments and labour abuse in supply chains. 1,300, 50% of them are about indigenous peoples and about and community leaders. And of course, the worst sectors in terms of this abuse are agriculture, mining, no surprise there, and renewable energy. Renewable energy is the third largest in terms of the number of people that are being put under attack and intimidation and murder because they are standing up essentially to the land grabs which are now endemic in much of the renewable energies industry. I won't go on. I'll move straight to my last point, which is really around the fact that on tech and human rights. On tech and human rights, in terms of business and human rights, I'll just say a few things. The first is that we have extraordinary risks and opportunities emerging there, and Julie's mentioned a couple of them. In terms of automation, of course, we have this extraordinary opportunity to free billions of people from the drudgery of daily grind that is made possible by that automation. But if we do it in the current context of profound inequality and the expression of that inequality ruthlessly through the supply chains, we will get simply a catastrophic loss of livelihoods in some of the poorest countries in the world, such as Cambodia, and particularly hitting women, of course, who are the women in the ICT and apparel footwear supply chains. On the gig economy, we have the opportunity for shared economies. We have the opportunity for far better responsive services. But we also have the opportunity of gig, as it's happening at the moment, to undermine profoundly the essential workers' rights. And on big data, we have the opportunity to really strengthen corporate due diligence, to be able for companies to know really well what's happening in their supply chains. But we can also, as Julie said, turbo drive the existing prejudices, the existing bigotries that already occur in our communities. So we face a stark choice on that. In conclusion, I would just say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has given birth to extraordinary fruits of civil and political rights around the world, and we should be enormously celebratory in this 70th anniversary. But as Samuel Moyes has said, one thing it's not tackled in any proper way is the fundamental inequality that's grown up simultaneously with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And business and human rights already inevitably is tackling some of that abuse. But over the next decade, the same movement has to start to really tackle the root causes of that abuse, the inequality and the ecological crisis that is upon us. We need to tackle decent work. We need to speak to the majority and not only the minorities, not just the indigenous people whose lands is being taken, but to the vast swathe of people who feel that they're in increasing levels of precarious employment and stagnant wages. We need to speak more boldly about the living wage and about decent work in order to be able to also describe that future that we all seek of shared prosperity. Because that's the only way that our economies are going to become sustainable. And otherwise, they will not deserve to be sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And your closing remarks do actually lead very, very nicely on to our final speaker. Alison, over to you.
They do, thank you. And thanks again to the organisers for inviting me here this evening. I think to be part of a conversation about the enduring relevance of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that puts economic and social rights so centrally in that conversation is very encouraging, and I'm very appreciative to be part of it. I've been asked to reflect on 3 questions. Why do socioeconomic rights matter? What specifically do they entail? And how are they being leveraged in struggles against economic inequality? I'd say these are quite deceptively straightforward questions. They're difficult to do justice to in 10 minutes, but hopefully in the discussion afterwards we can pick up on some of the themes that are of particular interest. And like Phil, I also took inspiration from Eleanor Roosevelt when I was thinking about my remarks for this evening. And I wanted to start close to home by reading a few lines from the statement that the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, recently made when he was here in the UK. After citing a range of statistics that really illustrate how the systematic dismantling of the social safety net have damaged people's lives here in the UK, Professor Alston concludes that in the 5th largest economy in the world, austerity is a political choice. He says, austerity could easily have spared the poor if the political will had existed to do so. Resources were available to the Treasury at the last budget that could have transformed the situation of millions of people in poverty, but the political choice was made to fund tax cuts for the wealthy instead. And to me, I think this conclusion really adds to the already ample evidence that economic inequality is both a cause and a consequence of human rights violations. As a cause, most obviously, unjust distributions of wealth translate into social disparities in access to goods and services, and these disparities frequently play out along gendered and racial lines. Unjust distributions of power distort access to justice and also perpetuate political capture that corrodes democracy and is breeding popular dissatisfaction, as we've already discussed this evening. But this compounding of economic inequality is the result of deliberate policy choices, and I think Professor Alston's findings really emphasize that. And these are policy choices that also breach human rights obligations, and I'll get into how in a little bit more detail. But some of these policy choices include decisions to enact regressive fiscal policies, decisions to erode workers' rights, decisions to privatize public services and to weaken social protection systems, or decisions to ignore the disproportionate burden that women take on when it comes to unpaid care work. As has already been highlighted, the same economic model that is fueling economic inequality is also pushing us closer and closer to the existential threat of climate breakdown. More and more voices are coming to, I think, the inescapable conclusion that to create societies that are environmentally sustainable and also socially just requires some fundamental changes to our economic model. So I think for us in the human rights movement, the question is, what is the role of human rights in pushing for those changes? In my view, it can play a very central role, and the reason for that is that rights assert that there are certain material needs that are so fundamental to human flourishing that they have to be guaranteed. They can't be left to the whims of the market. And that implies a very different set of decisions about the way the economy is structured and the way that resources are distributed. It also implies that the way that power is distributed needs to fundamentally change too, so that those decisions are more deeply democratic. So turning now to kind of what do socioeconomic rights entail, and more specifically, what obligations do they give rise to? I want to start by going back to the UDHR, and I do think economic inequality was on the minds of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it sets out a very egalitarian vision. It asserts that all human beings should enjoy a range of economic, social, and cultural rights that are, quote, indispensable for dignity. This includes rights to work and to just and favourable conditions of work, rights to education, rights to food, housing, medical care, and social services necessary to ensure an adequate standard of living. The Declaration also calls for a social and international order to give effect to these rights and commits states to taking progressive measures, both nationally and internationally. And as Sonia said, the Universal Declaration then was the foundation for subsequent developments of binding treaties in international law that elaborate further what specifically states are committed to doing when it comes to the realization of human rights. And in our work at the Centre for Economic and Social Rights, a major focus is on Article 2.1 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's a difficult article. What it says is that states commit to take steps individually and through international cooperation to the maximum of their available resources to progressively achieve the full realization of the rights contained in the covenant. So it's a mouthful, and it uses very conditional language, obviously the kind of product of diplomatic compromise. And this conditionality has given rise to accusations that this language is vague, imprecise, and unenforceable. However, interpretations of this article by various UN mechanisms, as well as by regional bodies and by national courts, has kind of unpacked and given more concrete meaning to what each of these components actually mean. And particularly in the last 25 years through the work of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I want to zoom in on one particular component that I think is especially relevant to the question of economic inequality, and this is states' obligations when it comes to resourcing rights. There's been, I think, a tendency within the human rights movement to grant states a wider margin of discretion when it comes to decisions about resources than there has been for other public policy areas. I think that's possibly because there are so many lawyers working in human rights and numbers are a bit of a concern. It's seen as a very technical topic that should be left to economists and not to human rights activists traditionally. I think what's really encouraging in our work is that we're starting to see that perception change now, that there really is the sense that just like every other area of government policy, economic policy should also be subject to human rights assessment. And as Phil mentioned, particularly since the financial crisis, the work of international mechanisms has really done a great deal to elaborate what standards are relevant when conducting that kind of assessment. And so I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of detail about that because I think it is still a very emerging area of international law development. So it's now kind of widely recognized that the obligation to dedicate maximum available resources to rights includes obligations relating to resource allocation, as well as to resource generation and resource spending. So the pie analogy is often used when talking about resources. We're interested not just in how the pie is divided, but also how big it is and also who's eating it. And of course, kind of human rights process principles around transparency, accountability, and participation cut across those three dimensions of resource decision making. So when it comes to allocation, states must show that they're investing sufficient resources in the realization of rights and have to avoid cuts that are deliberately retrogressive. And the committee has outlined criteria for determining when retrogressive measures may be permissible. In terms of generation of resources, there's an interrogation as to the sufficiency of revenue raised, including a need to closely examine tax exemptions and efforts to combat tax abuse, as well as questions around the distribution and the progressivity of the tax burden. When it comes to spending, the kind of illegal diversion of public funds has become a topic of increasing concern amongst human rights accountability mechanisms. And when it comes to processes and decision-making related to resources, I think there's been a lot of effort to make tax and budgetary decisions more democratic, including through a variety of different human rights budgeting initiatives. So I think that kind of lays the framework of how international human rights law can be used to start tackling questions of economic inequality and the unjust distribution of resources. So my kind of final remarks relate to how these norms are being used and leveraged by civil society and NGOs who are taking economic inequality at the center of their work. And the first point I want to make is that the human rights movement is incredibly diverse and dynamic. I think that's a real strength, but I think it is often underappreciated in some of the criticism of the human rights movement. There's an ecosystem of accountability mechanisms that exist within the human rights world. These are legal and administrative and political and social. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. Of course, they start at the local level and go right up to the international level. This makes it difficult to sum up some of the tactics and the strategies that different social movements and NGOs and networks are using. So I'll instead kind of say a few words about the work that the Center for Economic and Social Rights has done, which very much fits into this kind of systems thinking approach of how to interrogate public policy using human rights norms. And so our approach is to collaborate on interdisciplinary rights-based policy analysis and advocacy. And what that means is drawing on a broad range of data to assess policies of resource distribution against human rights standards and principles, highlighting both where they fall short and exposing how they drive inequality. And so some of the key drivers of inequality that we've focused on in our work recently include austerity, in a range of countries, not just in Europe. So as well as Spain, we've also done work in Brazil and most recently in South Africa. Looking at IMF loan conditions, in particular in Egypt following the Arab Spring. Looking at the Global Development Agenda, the 2030 Agenda, which despite its great transformative potential so far looks a lot like business as usual. And the Centre is part of the Spotlight on Sustainable Development initiative, which is a civil society-led attempt to monitor progress against the goals and the targets. And finally, tax abuse. And we've looked at the impacts of financial secrecy policies in Switzerland in particular on the capacity of developing countries to invest in rights realization. So that's a small snapshot of some of the kind of the tools and strategies that are being used to leverage the normative standards of human rights to try and combat economic inequality. I think the growing momentum on tackling the unjust and unsustainable economic model that we have, both within and beyond the human rights movement, is an incredibly positive development. Inequality is a complex and systematic and intersectional problem. But at its heart, inequality is a problem of power, as Phil already said. We know, broadly speaking, what the solutions to it are. But there are very powerful vested interests in the status quo that need to shift, and that's hard to do. I really believe that human rights is an important tool in building power, but given the scale of the problem that we have, I think it's a tool that we need to leverage more boldly and better coordinated way than we have to date.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm really sort of struck, having listened to the three speakers, by the fact that one of the great achievements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the way that it did bring together a vision of human rights that encompassed not only civil and political rights, but also socio-economic and cultural rights. And yet we've sort of heard a thesis building around the privileging of civil and political rights in these 70 years to date that has coincided with a set of market forces that have given rise to the most extraordinary economic inequality that has in turn fired a set of grievances that threaten to consume the human rights project as a whole. And I think that really is probably a very good starting point actually for opening up the discussion for reflections, questions from the floor. We have a very interesting array of people with us tonight, many from the human rights world, from the world of diplomacy, many of you from the worlds of business and law, many academics and the like. So a lot of perspectives that I hope we're going to be able to draw out. If we could take questions in sets of 3, that would be brilliant. We can build a discussion that way. Please could you identify yourself, your name, and your affiliation so that the room has a sense of where you're coming from. So I'll start. One question here. Yeah. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ratib Al-Sulaiman. I'm from Bright Future Foundation, which is charity helping the Syrian refugee. Congratulations for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as 70 years. And I'm proud of all of you doing the good speech and the people, they come in. All we care about the human rights and the people. And my cousin, I left behind, you know, in Syria, we have the war the last 7 years. I lost one of my cousins, which he's a young family. He have 2 kids. And he died in the prison, actually, because he's starving. He stayed for years and years and years. And he died because there's no food. And the government of Syria, they haven't actually given us his body or given anything about this person we lose. And as the Syrian refugee, they come to this country. We seen yesterday or before yesterday the video of Mr. Jamal, which is a child being abused in the school. And this has happened to even my children. My children, they born in this country, and they get a lots of abuse. And unfortunately, we still haven't got anything done about it by the government, by the people responsible. We can see this, and the people, they turn a blind eye. I strongly recommend, like, the government should take more strong action against all these people abuse of a human right, because a human right is very important to all of us. And if somebody can abuse this right, then we can't control these things anymore. So I'm very happy for you and for your speak, and I would like to thank you very much, and this is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more, a gentleman and a lady at the back.
Hello, my name's Martin Pick. I'm very moved by what this gentleman has just said, because in a way it highlights how far things have gone in this country already for the worse. We are seeing on many fronts an increase in intolerance and aggression towards minority communities. I spent 8 years on the board of Minority Rights Group, which is, as some of you will know, a research institute looking at position of minorities in different parts of the world. And this is a new phenomenon that in this country, which was always regarded internationally as the home of human rights causes and a home for issues that could be raised in a more impartial way in international fora. And suddenly now, in the last few years, things have moved backwards very fast. And we've got the appalling situation with our visa system, which seems to be in total disarray, a government that has failed to recognize the need for clear rules and laws affecting people coming into this country. We're in this real mess, as we all know, and just getting worse with the Brexit situation. And we are now finding that there's aggression towards young people who've come to this country after being persecuted in their original countries, in the classroom, in the schools. And in a way, that's a very interesting symbol of how bad things have got. So I'm sorry to go on like this, but I do think this gentleman's point is of great importance. And I think the way in which Dr. Alston's report last week or the week before was completely rubbished by the government is an appalling indictment of where our government stands. Sorry to go on so long.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you. And then
thank you to all the speakers. My name's Alma Marston, and I research transformative resilience. And I guess in many respects, I see the UDHR and the formation of the United Nations and even the European Union as a historic example of transformative resilience, where you have these horrible events that take place broadly, affecting not only Europe, but the whole world, and from it forge new institutions, new joint efforts to codify rights and protections. You may have a different interpretation, but with that premise, how do we use this moment to forge the next iterations of institutions or the next collaborations on one hand? And then specifically, Phil, how do we put a fire under business or incentivize business? Because as much as you have called for government to guide that, in many respects, you now see the public looking to business leaders for action more so than government leaders. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've had, three interjections from the floor. Firstly, a very impassioned plea around enforcement. We haven't actually touched on that much in our panel tonight, so I really sort of welcome what are these standards worth if at the end of the day, in the face of such serious violations, there is a sense of impunity and no meaningful response for the rights of victims. A kind of response to that really did take us close to home, literally, in the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt's great quote, and turning the frame, if you like, or the mirror back on the United Kingdom and some of the great human rights challenges and failings on the part of our government, I would say, in response to that. We'll have some response to that. And then a very sort of interesting set of questions rooted in an idea of transformative resilience, and Phil, a specific question for you on the business agenda. So let's start with you, then maybe go to Alison, and then to you, Julie.
Thanks. I think just a very small remark on the issues of the rise of hate crime, the rise of hate speech, etc. And we can go into this in more detail if people want, because there's a whole issue about the role of social media, the role of Facebook, etc. But I'd just make two short pieces that, human beings are both angels and demons, and we activate one or the other, and in various balances at any one time. And that is created by the conditions around us and by our own choices as well. And I think the reality is that we have a government that has created a hostile environment, explicitly a hostile environment to migrants. And therefore, we should not be surprised if we elect a government of that nature. We should not be surprised when that translates into the kind of videos that we saw last night, the appalling videos that we saw last night, and which we know, let's face it, nobody's surprised by it. We all know this is happening in our communities. In Oxford, where I live, there are now swastikas on the wall, in Oxford, for God's sake. But alongside that, this is a battle. Every generation has to fight the same bloody terrain. We are compelled and destined, it is our fate to fight the same battles over and over again. And I would only say that in Oxford, when Steve Bannon came to speak at the Oxford Union, despicably invited, there was a massive crowd outside there that demonstrated the extraordinary public disdain for a man like that, and an Oxford University Union that would also invite him. The same happened when Marine Le Pen arrived for her invitation, and the same mass demonstration on the streets of Oxford happened when there was a call for a mobilisation around the need for us to provide real protection for refugees during that mass migration into Europe. So those two things are constantly happening. Our job is to constantly work to drive the movement for good, the movement for our angelic form rather than for our demonic form. The second thing I'd just say is, in terms of, just going back to that issue of business and leadership, which I think is a fundamental issue. I think we see all the time extraordinary leadership by some businesses and by some business leaders. And I'm inspired by that. But they are a relatively small cluster of business leaders. But they are fundamentally important to the model of change that the business and human rights movement has. First of all, that volunteerism that demonstrates what is commercially viable and a moral imperative. It demonstrates what is feasible. And therefore it demonstrates also that the laggards, the vast majority of laggard companies who are not doing enough to bring human rights due diligence into their global supply chains and operations, are effectively doing it because they are mismanaging their companies, because they could be doing this level of due diligence and are simply out of ignorance or out of indifference, and probably both, they are refusing to do so or failing to do so. And so again, I think from that perspective, this fundamental nature of business leadership, the leadership there is critical. I'll give you just one quick example, if I may. I mean, we, amidst all this crisis of attacks on human rights defenders, who are basically going up against massive vested interests, and therefore facing intimidation, attacks, and murders. In all that, we actually we formed a business network to try and raise a business voice out. And they've just put out this report, Shared Space Under Pressure, where they, as a group of business, a group of 25 of the largest companies in the world, basically endorse a position that says, we cannot, as responsible businesses, thrive in closing and civic and political environments. We need and depend upon the same civic freedoms that civil society depends upon. And therefore, because in the situations of closing civic space and so closing civic freedoms, all we get is crony capitalism and we get massive scales of corruption, where responsible business can never compete. And so it's important that we get these kind of statements out from those businesses. But the volunteerism in and of itself and alone, I do not believe will allow us to create the kind of sustainable economy that is necessary. And that has been a profound failure a profound delusion of much of our movement over the last period. It has to be demonstrated, it has to be accompanied by that sense of real incentives to reward businesses that are doing the right thing, public procurement, export credit guarantees, as well as the minimum floor through regulation. And that, I think, is where the French due diligence law, the loi de vigilance, is groundbreaking at the moment in terms of Europe, but which is also starting to become more prevalent in terms of the Dutch law, elements of what Obama introduced on modern slavery in the United States. The German National Action Plan indicates that they will do that by 2020 if certain conditions aren't made. So that's there, I think, and necessary.
Yeah, a few reflections that relate to the comments. I think first, thank you so much for sharing that story. I think when we talk about human rights, because they're couched in this language of universalism and aspiration, that comes with a degree of abstraction. But your story really reminds us how, what the stakes are and how human this is and how important this is. And I think it also reminds us that we can't be narrow in our focus as human rights being only a legal project. I mean, the international law gives us the kind of the heft and the power building aspect. And Philip Alston again made that point very strongly. That what differentiates human rights from ideas of fairness or other ethical or moral projects is the kind of the concrete obligations that are attached to them. But at the same time, human rights is also a moral project and is also a political project. And when we think about the kinds of institutions that we need to be building, they need to speak to and span across all three of those dimensions of human rights. I think on institutions too, as I said, it's a diverse and dynamic movement, and I don't want to make too many kind of sweeping statements, but I think in many instances we have been somewhat weak in terms of public mobilization and local organizing. I think that's those kinds of very local, very community-based rights work are the kinds of institutions that we need to invest more energy and resources into. But at the same time, I think we need to be building networks and alliances, not just within the human rights movement, but also beyond it. One of the challenges that we see a lot is kind of siloing and fragmentation of our analysis and of our advocacy. Even with economic, social, and cultural rights is one little cluster over here, and business and human rights is a cluster over here. Even within economic, social, and cultural rights, there's people working on housing and people working on health, and not always talking and coordinating as much as we need to be. So I think the institutions that we want are local, but are networked and span the kind of four levels of organizing, of local, national, regional, and international, and move back and forth between them. Because it's current, I keep mentioning it, but Philip Holston's visit, I mean, that there is the gravitas of a UN envoy coming to the country that is important, but what's more important is the community groups and the NGOs and the civil society organizations that are here and are using that kind of additional amplification of their message from the UN to kind of continue efforts that are happening here in the UK.
I'll be super brief because I think anything that I have to say just echoes what's already been said. But I think there is a real link between all of these questions because, as we've already alluded to, it stated the rise in hate crimes, the rise in discrimination against minorities is really closely connected with the existing social inequalities and the economic inequality. And I think that those economic issues are really linked to what I would call sort of a market fundamentalism, where that really gives businesses and corporations far more power than individual humans. And so thinking about what kind of institutions we need in the future, I think we do need those institutions that put people at the center and that get us back to human rights being about the individual and helping to curb some of the power of corporations as well as governments. And Phil is obviously doing a lot of that good work already.
Brilliant. Let's go back to the floor. Okay, we're going to go to the front here. Woman.
Thank you for a really exciting and wonderful panel. My name is Tanya Charles. I'm also an Atlantic Fellow at the LSE. My question kind of grows from what Phil said, and I really enjoyed your kind of analysis of the relationship between business and human rights. But I'm interested in one of the things you said, where putting human rights at the core of business to address public distrust of global markets. And that kind of struck me because my first question is, why should people trust the markets? And I mean, you teased, everyone basically has, very interesting things to say about, how we need to transform economies. But the markets, especially if you think about neoliberalism, the rise of populism, and, fundamentalisms of all kind, is not and has not been for a while a place where people have been at the center. So are we trying to reimagine the markets? Are we shifting them? Are we talking about a new economics, as Alison had alluded to? Because I think for me, my suspicion around markets as any kind of avenue or pathway to justice is kind of heightened. So I'd love more on exactly what you meant by that and how you conceive of a market that has people at the center. Thank you.
Thank you. And then a gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Kolbasia, and sorry. Yeah, my name is Kolbasia, and I am survival advocate at Freedom from Torture. My question is come down to the universal human right, and also all the subsequent, declaration that come, after that. But the one thing that is missing, for me, because I'm a torture survivor, and as such, I still find it very difficult that when it comes to finding solution, when it comes to addressing, human rights, victims, survivors, and human right holders, mainly regarded as testimony provider, instead of expert that can contribute, part of the solution. 70 years now, what are we doing now, kind of to reverse that, and then creating a space for right holder to be part of solution? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a question down here at the front.
My name's Ian Martin. I was Secretary General of Amnesty International at the time of the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what Amnesty International did in 1988, thanks to a half-crazy director of our US section, was organize a music tour, the Human Rights Now tour, which went around the world to every region, with Sting, Bruce Springsteen, Peter Gabriel, U2, etc., reaching young people in countries around the world and millions more as a television audience to make known the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it said. And I don't see anybody thinking in those kinds of terms during the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the 30 years since then, there's been an explosion of human rights organizations. One of my colleagues went on to found Business and Human Rights Resource Center, excellent organization. Another's the executive director of the Economic and Social Rights. A lot were associated with freedom from torture. There's been a professionalization of human rights. There are streams of people coming out of universities these days with human rights law degrees. Those organizations have become very dependent on philanthropy. And the human rights world has also, for a long time, depended on trying to use the goodwill of Western governments that were supposed to be committed to human rights to put pressure on other governments and to tell Barack Obama when he goes to Beijing that he must beat up on the Chinese on human rights, which wasn't very useful even then and looks less and less plausible today. So the question I want to come to is, several of you have used the word movement at one time or another. I'm not sure there's a human rights movement. Networks, alliances are all good things. They're not a movement. There are social movements, but this is a moment when what is actually needed is a human rights movement, and austerity and inequality provides, in a way, fertile ground for such a movement. But what do you all think the human rights movement is, if you use the term, and what can be done to make it effective in the time of the 70th anniversary?
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just recap those briefly. So we have a very kind of erudite question about markets, whether they are the problem or the solution, in short. A contribution about the role of rights holders themselves in the visioning of the solutions to the problems that we've been articulating this evening. And then a big meta question about, well, challenging, I guess, the sort of premise of some of this conversation tonight, that actually we have built a human rights movement, and a challenge to the panel to reflect on, if we don't have a human rights movement, how do we build one? Or if we do have one, how do we build it to be stronger? So let's start with you, Julie, and then we'll go to Phil, and then we'll finish with you on the end. Yes.
First, I want to say I love the idea of a music tour for the UDHR. You know, I've got all kinds of ideas now of that, and I think that does get at some of what I was saying in my remarks, that there is a real interest, I think, in getting back to that sort of art and popular culture, and how can we use that as vehicles for promoting human rights to a wider, broader audience. Not just to, you know, the lawyers that come to our talks. I may have been one of the people guilty of using the word movement, but I was referring to it more in terms of social movements, because, I mean, I think that you're right that the human rights field has become increasingly professionalized, and that is one of the criticisms that is now leveled at it in terms of its connections to people, to local communities, because it has become seen as sort of an elite profession, you know, lawyers and academics sitting a little bit removed from some of the front lines of human rights. And increasingly, there's a real interest, I think, in, you know, what are the power of some of those social movements, and some of the social movements actually reject some of the human rights organizations as saying, well, you're not really connected to the people because we're really connected to the people. And I think that there is a human rights infrastructure that is there, that we need to protect and we need to defend, but we also need to encourage it to connect more with people and with social movements. so that it does become more real for people. And because the trend of becoming too professionalized is a dangerous one. I mean, I think it's, as a donor, of course, I like boards of trustees and, nice audits and things like that. But nonetheless, that can't really be the thing that is the deciding factor at the end of the day. I also really appreciate this point about victims and rights holders being exploited in a way, used for testimony, used for evidence, but they maybe perhaps not put at the center of any kind of process. And I do think, I think it's a problem, but I think there are also, people that recognize that, organizations that recognize that, and I think it comes back to this issue of needing to deepen the roots of human rights work in communities by really engaging with victims and with rights holders as the people who need to take things forward. They're not just there to provide legal evidence, but they're there to build a society and to build a community, and they do need to be a part of the process and a center of the process, and not just instrumentalized. So I take your point. Phil.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I think that in terms of the issue around markets is really that markets is a word that can be filled with different meanings. At the moment, we have a dominant discourse, to use an awful phrase, but we have a discourse that says, markets must occupy not just the normal places, but should be occupying even our own private spaces. And that if you're not, you must have probably all either seen the film or read the book, The Circle, sharing is caring. If you're not sharing your data, i.e. giving it to people who can sell it on, then somehow you're not caring. And so we're finding an extraordinary penetration of market into the most private areas of our lives. And that's, to my mind, it's deeply pernicious. There's another approach to markets, which is much more about what works in terms of delivering shared prosperity and shared security for people. In some places, that's definitely markets. Markets are extraordinarily effective in ensuring that capital can be allocated to the right places, that we can get efficient, productive systems which release people from the drudgery of labour. The increases in productivity when those things are working well are extraordinary. But I'll give you just one example of how the kind of market fundamentalism now is so profound. Over the last 40 years, the average longevity of a shareholding has gone from 6 years to 6 months. Okay? So there's no loyalty being demonstrated by the shareholders themselves. They are simply grazing the planet for the cheapest needle and the cheapest plough to be able to extract as much value as they can from it. In that same time, the share of the wealth generated by that capital, and by the labour in particular involved in it, the share taken by shareholders has gone up over the last 40 years from 10% to 60%. So again, you've got people like the chief economist of the Bank of England saying Anglo-Saxon capitalism is in danger of eating itself because it's not even leaving enough for investment in the productivity gains, hence the very low productivity gains that we get. So we've got a situation where that kind of, to my mind, that approach to markets is way out of control. But if you look at the Millennium Development Goals. The only reason we achieved the Millennium Development Goals was because of China. The only reason, or one of the main reasons that China achieved the Millennium Development Goals in terms of ensuring that almost 1 billion people were brought out of absolute poverty was because they also introduced market reforms. And so, again, there's the extraordinary power of market and the extraordinarily pernicious nature of markets. And it's up to governments, which we need to re-elect our governments, to do the right thing in terms of shaping markets so they deliver for us as a public, the common good. and the shared prosperity that we need. Now, right now, and I'm going to stop with this because I'll go on and on, but the other thing to remember is, of course, we're entering in this new phase of extraordinary. We're heading for, you know, another mass extinction, and we're heading for climate breakdown. So there's an extraordinary shift that has to happen in those markets. And I think, you know, one thing that I've drawn encouragement from, at least, is Kate Raworth's work on donor economics and the fact that we can define what those planetary boundaries are, outside of which we are dangerously imperiling ourselves and the planet. And we also have social minima that everybody should be able to make sure that they have housing, health, education, living wage, etc. And then within that, there is a boundary in which everybody can play. You know, everybody, we can define what kind of societies we want according to our cultural values and our social values, etc. So that's the way I'd see it. Just to come, I'd say one last thing, and that is, in terms of the movement, I take your point entirely, of course. The thing that I would say is that, firstly, in terms of this issue of we need the movement, I'm not sure it's a human rights movement, to be honest. I think it's a much broader movement that we need. I think we need the environment movement, the women's movement, the social justice movements, the human rights movement, and the labour movements to come together to start to really project a singular, not a singular, a set of minimum demands that we expect in terms that reaches out to the broad public, that speaks to the extraordinary fears of precariousness that are out there, just as Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen do exactly the same. We need to be speaking to those fears of precariousness, those fears of poverty wages and climate breakdown in ways which inspire, and we don't have that yet, and we are struggling with it. So come on, Ian, you can come in and help us on that. But I do think, finally, you know, it is up to us in the end to do this. Treaties will not do it for us. I mean, I'll just read you one quote from Emily Hafner-Burton, you know, the fantastic professor, but who's done all this work looking at the impact of treaties and laws and etc. And she says, international human rights law tends to protect human beings in the settings where the worst human rights abuse is least likely to occur. Despite that evidence, much of today's policy efforts, and I would say efforts of the movement, are focused on creating more international treaties. We need to focus on the delivery of the treaties that already exist. We need the movement to demand that those fundamental human rights that are already enshrined really are delivered. And that's what I think some of the great challenges over the next period are.
Alison, over to you for the final
Yeah, so
word.
I think, echoing a lot of what's already been said, certainly movement has become kind of a convenient shorthand for this cluster of various actors, and it is important to critically reflect on what that looks like and how it can be strengthened. Just kind of one additional point, I think it's very easy to sit on a panel and say, well, we need to be better at building alliances and we need to be better at public mobilization. And actually I think the question that we need to be asking is, why haven't we been good at this so far? And I think a couple of thoughts on that, you know, why haven't we been more successful piece? You know, I do think that the continued bias towards civil and political rights in many parts of the human rights cluster, let's call it, has really disadvantaged the human rights discourse's ability to resonate and to speak to people's lived reality, as Phil said. I think it's also meant that a lot of the human rights analysis has really been limited to documenting symptoms of various systemic problems and not really digging deep enough into, we can call them root causes or more systematic ways of looking at these kind of interconnected issues. And I think that also speaks to the question about the role of rights holders. I think we, in giving our diagnosis of the kinds of deprivations and violations that we're concerned with, we do need to look at how kind of the lived experience of rights holders can be made front and center of that analysis. And I think unless we do that, we'll continue to struggle to resonate and to be salient for a lot of people that we want to reach. And a final point, I think hopefully a positive one to end on, I do think that because of a lot of human rights work is so much about documenting what's problematic and what's going wrong, we don't spend as much time kind of laying out a positive vision for what it is that we want the world to look like. And so I think that's another reason why the human rights discourse maybe hasn't stuck as much as it needs to. So investing more energy in kind of, if these norms were to be given effect, what does that look like? And communicating that in an effective way is a really crucial part of our movement building, I'd say.
Thank you very much. So I hope that you will agree that this evening we've got the balance right between an honouring of the Universal Declaration and the broader human rights project that it forms part of, but also an application of a critical lens to some of the challenges that are really holding back the realisation of the ideals that the Declaration does represent. Lots of ideas tonight for deepening impact, and I think that's probably the most important note for us to end on. Please join me, in thanking our three fantastic speakers, and thank you also for joining us tonight. Thank you.